Jewish tradition has a word for God's presence filling up a room: Shekinah. And here's the strange part. That word isn't in your Bible anywhere. Not the Old Testament, not the New Testament, not once. It comes from a plain Hebrew verb used constantly across the Old Testament for moving into a place and staying, not just stopping by. That verb is SHAKAN, and it's the reason the tent Moses built in the wilderness is called what it's called. Tabernacle in Hebrew is mishkan, and mishkan is built directly out of SHAKAN. Same root, same word family. One is literally the child of the other. We're not going to unpack everything SHAKAN means just yet. That comes soon, and it's worth the wait. For now, hold on to this much. It's not a word for a quick visit. It's a word for moving in. And once you know that, a handful of stories scattered across the Bible start to look like one long story instead. SHAKAN is the word the Bible uses every time God moves his address closer to his people. A tent in the wilderness, and centuries later, a body born in Bethlehem. Most of us know that difference already. There's a difference between someone crashing on your couch for a weekend and someone changing their mailing address to yours. One is a visit, the other is permanent. The Bible draws that same line between two kinds of presence, and SHAKAN is the word it uses to draw it. Over the next half hour or so, we're going to follow that one word through 6 very different scenes. We'll stand with the Israelites as they build a portable house for God. It's made of goat hair and acacia wood, measured down to the smallest cubit. We'll watch a king ask out loud in front of everyone whether a building could really hold what he'd just spent 7 years constructing. We'll climb a hill with pilgrims singing about an address God chose on purpose. We'll sit with a prophet in exile as he watches something leave, and later as he watches it come back for good. And we'll end somewhere you might not expect. It's a place with no building in it at all, because the thing SHAKAN was always pointing to finally doesn't need one. 6 scenes, 1 word, 1 long story about an address that keeps changing, always in the same direction. But before any of that, we need to go back to the word itself. SHAKAN shows up more than 100 times in the Old Testament, and almost every English Bible flattens it down to one plain little verb: dwell. Here's what that translation hides. That flattening is where we start. Dwell is one of the quietest words in an English Bible. It sits on the page and does almost nothing. Something dwells somewhere, the way a spider dwells in a corner, or an old memory dwells in the back of your mind. It just exists there, passive, present tense. The Hebrew word underneath it isn't quiet at all. That word is SHAKAN, Strong's number H7931, and it shows up more than 100 times across the Old Testament. Ask a Hebrew lexicon what it means, and you'll get something like this: to reside or permanently stay, literally or figuratively. Not to exist somewhere, to settle, to move in and stay put. SHAKAN is a suitcase hitting the floor for good, not a coat draped over a chair for the night. Here's what gets lost when English flattens SHAKAN down to dwell. First, a family connection disappears completely. The tent Moses builds in the wilderness, the one God gives 13 chapters of blueprints for, gets called the Tabernacle in English. In Hebrew, it's the mishkan, not some unrelated architectural term borrowed from nowhere. It's built directly out of SHAKAN, same 3 consonants, same root. Look up mishkan on its own in a lexicon, and you'll find it defined as a residence, specifically the tabernacle, dwelling place, tent, tabernacle. 3 different English words, all borrowed from one Hebrew root. The tabernacle is, quite literally, the dwelling. An English reader sees dwell in one place and tabernacle in another with no obvious reason to connect them. A Hebrew reader hears the same word twice. Second, and maybe more importantly, dwell can sound passive in a way SHAKAN never does. In modern English, dwelling somewhere often just means being located there, wherever you happen to end up. SHAKAN carries the weight of an active decision. It means someone chose this place on purpose and moved in for good, expecting to stay, everything they own already unpacked. That distinction changes how the whole tabernacle story reads. It stops being a series of unconnected supernatural visits, God popping in for a miracle and popping back out again. It becomes one continuous story about an address, about a place God keeps choosing. You can see the difference most clearly at the very beginning, on a mountain, months before any of it gets built. God gives Moses the plans for the tabernacle on Mount Sinai. The instructions are almost overwhelming in their detail. Gold overlay, acacia wood frames, blue and purple and scarlet yarn, dimensions measured down to the cubit. It's easy to get lost in that list. Skip past it, though, and you miss the one line explaining why any of this needs to exist at all. Let them make me a sanctuary, God says in Exodus chapter 25, that I may dwell in their midst. One purpose clause buried in a construction manual, carrying the entire weight of the project. SHAKAN again. Not that I may visit them, that I may dwell. Consider how much of Exodus gets spent on this single idea. 13 chapters, close to a third of the entire book, are devoted to tabernacle instructions and construction, the kind of architectural precision the ancient world usually reserved for royal palaces. This wasn't some untouchable monument sealed off behind palace walls either. Day to day, it was something ordinary Israelite men hoisted onto their own shoulders and physically reassembled by hand at every single stop for 40 years. Goat hair curtains and ram skins dyed red went up and came down again and again, and acacia frames knocked together in the dust every time the camp packed up and moved on. Then comes the moment all of it had been building toward. The last piece gets set into place, and a cloud drops so thick over the tent that Moses himself, the one man who'd stood closest to God on that same mountain, can't even go inside. Whatever had just moved in filled the whole structure, with no room left over for anyone else. Exodus doesn't pause to explain it further. It simply states the fact and lets the weight of 13 chapters land behind it. This wasn't a one-time dramatic flash, gone as quickly as it came. It was a blueprint for an ongoing residence, portable enough to travel with a people mid-journey, planned in more detail than almost anything else in the Torah, because God actually meant to live there. Not visit, live there. Picture the mood on the day that cloud finally descends. Months of measuring and weaving and hammering had built into something close to giddy anticipation, meticulous right up until the last plank was set. Then, all at once, it lands. The hush of something enormous actually arriving. That's SHAKAN at its first full appearance in this story. A tent goes up, God moves in, and stays. This is the first move-in, and it won't be the last one. An address that keeps changing, always in the same direction, closer rather than farther, unfolding through nearly every book still ahead. Centuries later, a different king stands inside a very different building, generations removed from that wilderness tent, and the same cloud finds him anyway. Solomon has just finished the temple in Jerusalem. It's no longer a tent stitched from goat hair and acacia wood. This is a permanent house of cedar and gold, 7 years in the making, with the ark carried in and set down in the inner room. The priests step back, and SHAKAN happens again. A cloud fills the house so completely that they can't even stand up to do their jobs. Same word, same kind of event. Only now the tent has become a building of stone. What Solomon says next is worth sitting with. He stands in front of the entire nation at the dedication of the very house he just spent a fortune building, and he asks something close to a public confession of doubt. Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Picture that moment. Solemn pride shot through with real doubt, and a crowd catching it, wide-eyed, half a breath from disbelief that the king himself would say such a thing out loud, in public, at his own dedication. It's the kind of line that could stop a room, coming from the one man who had every reason to sound certain. This was Solomon, after all, the same king known across the ancient world for his wisdom. He stood at the exact moment he might simply have declared victory instead, and said this instead. He built the house. He still isn't fully sure God will really live in it. That's not what you'd expect from a dedication speech. You'd expect triumph, maybe a victory lap after 7 years of hard construction. Instead, the man who paid for all of it raises the one question the whole project was supposed to answer. Think about how that temple got built in the first place. It took 7 years. The construction site itself stayed strangely silent the whole time. The stone blocks were shaped and finished somewhere else entirely, cut and fitted before they ever reached Jerusalem, then carried in already complete. According to the account, neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. Every piece showed up finished. No noise on site, just assembly, stone settling quietly into stone. Picture that for a moment. An entire building rising in near total silence. It didn't matter. Even that level of care, that deliberate precision, wasn't enough to settle Solomon's own question. A building this expensive, this gold-lined, still couldn't guarantee the thing it was built for. Pride and doubt end up sitting in the same sentence, from the same man, on the same day. And even the most careful, most impressive house in the ancient world couldn't fully answer what SHAKAN was really asking. That tension carries the story forward, because it turns out this word was never only about buildings, expensive or otherwise. It didn't matter how much gold lined the walls, or how quiet the construction site stayed. Generations after Solomon, ordinary worshippers climbed toward that same temple, and their reason for climbing had nothing to do with stone or cedar at all. They weren't building anything or paying for anything. They were just walking uphill, singing, toward a decision God had made long before any of them were born. Psalm 132 belongs to a small group of songs called the Songs of Ascent, Psalms 120 through 134. Jewish tradition holds that pilgrims sang one psalm per step while climbing the stairs up to the Temple Mount for the annual festivals. Picture it. Out of breath, mid-climb, singing about the very reason they were climbing. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. The word desired shows up twice in 2 verses. This isn't rule-keeping. It's something closer to wanting. You can imagine that same climb happening year after year, generation after generation. Grandparents who'd sung this same psalm decades earlier, walking it again beside grandchildren too young yet to know why any of it mattered. That word matters more than it might seem. Solomon's temple could raise the question of whether God would really live there. This song answers it from the opposite direction, not as a duty God reluctantly agreed to, but as something he actually wanted. There's a plain, unforced pride running through the whole psalm. None of Solomon's second-guessing, just people glad, breathlessly glad, uphill and out of breath, singing about a choice God made on purpose. Out of every hill in the land, God picked this one. For the people singing it, halfway up a stone staircase, this wasn't some abstract theological idea. It was the reason their legs were tired and their lungs were burning at that exact moment. They were climbing toward an address God had chosen because He wanted to, step after step, sweating through a festival crowd. And that mattered enough to sing about between ragged gasps for breath. No one needed to convince them the address was real. They were living proof of it, one step at a time. Between Solomon's honest doubt and the pilgrim's breathless certainty sits the same word, doing two very different jobs, raising the question in one story, answering it in the next. Not every part of this story moves toward more presence. This one moves away. Generations after Solomon, the nation that built and dedicated that temple slowly filled it with idols instead of the God it was built for, the same address used for something it was never meant to hold. Ezekiel, a priest by training, watches what happens next. He's not in Jerusalem, he's in exile in Babylon, camped beside an irrigation canal called the Kibar, roughly 900 miles from the building he was raised to serve in, trained for a role he may never actually get to fill. In a vision, he watches the glory of the Lord rise up off the inner sanctuary. It doesn't just vanish. It pauses first, right at the threshold, the way someone lingers in a doorway they don't want to walk through. Then it mounts the cherubim and moves out, deliberately, through the east gate of the temple, coming to rest over the mountain east of the city. Most readers skim right past that geography, but it's worth slowing down and paying attention to. The vision doesn't just say the glory left, it tracks the exact route, gate by gate. Picture someone walking out of a house they've lived in for years, glancing back once, taking the long way to the door instead of just disappearing. That pause at the threshold matters more than almost anything else in the scene. Whatever this presence is, it doesn't rush toward the exit. And that's the hard truth sitting underneath this whole scene. SHAKAN, the same word that once promised God would move in and stay, turns out to describe a move out, too. God's dwelling was never some unconditional fixture bolted permanently to the building. It's the difference between a guest who never really unpacked in the first place and someone pulling their own furniture back out the door, piece by piece, because they've genuinely, reluctantly decided to go. Picture where Ezekiel is standing when he sees all this happen. Not in Jerusalem, not anywhere near the temple. He's roughly 900 miles away, in exile, beside that specific canal, and as a priest, he likely never even got to serve inside the building he's now watching empty out. He's not just witnessing this loss from some comfortable, safe distance. He's not alone out there either. An entire community of exiles sits with him along that same canal, piecing together scraps of news from a home most of them will never see again. But he's still watching it secondhand, from a riverbank hundreds of miles from home. There's nothing he can do about any of it, no way to run back and stop it. No role left to play in a building he spent his whole life training to serve. It's a raw, homesick kind of grief, watching something this enormous leave in slow motion. More like watching a scene unfold from far away on a screen than actually living inside it, close enough to touch. But that's not where the story leaves it, thankfully. Grief this raw rarely gets the final word in this kind of story, and it doesn't get it here either. Later in the same book, Ezekiel gets shown another vision, a future temple this time, and something extraordinary happens at its dedication. The glory of the Lord comes back. It doesn't slip back in quietly either, the way you might expect after such a long absence. The text specifies the exact route. The glory enters by the way of the gate facing east, the identical gate it left through in the earlier vision. Same exact door, reversed, deliberately, on purpose. And it doesn't arrive with the hush of a settling cloud this time, the way it did back in the wilderness. Ezekiel describes the sound of its return as being like the sound of many waters. The earth itself shines from the glory. It's something closer to a roaring tide rolling in than a quiet cloud easing down over a tent. Sound, light, motion, all of it at once. Nothing subtle left to wonder about this time. Then comes a promise Solomon's dedication speech never quite dared to make outright all those generations earlier. Back then, the king himself wasn't sure the arrangement would hold. This time, a voice says, "This is the place of my throne, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever." Forever. Not the cautious, half-certain hope from Solomon's dedication. A flat, unqualified promise. After showing in vivid and painful detail that this presence really can leave, Ezekiel's second vision insists the next move-in simply doesn't end. Gratitude like that rarely lands all at once after a loss this real. It tends to come in waves instead, overwhelming, each one hitting a little harder than the one before it, arriving late and then simply continuing on, wave after wave. Think about the shape of the story so far. The tent filled with cloud once, out in the wilderness. The temple filled next, and Solomon doubted it out loud at his own dedication. Generations later, it emptied out completely, watched from 900 miles away by a priest who could do nothing but watch. And now, one more time, it fills again, carrying a promise none of the earlier scenes ever got to make. That word isn't finished with this story yet. Skip ahead now, past every tent and temple this story has passed through so far, to the final 2 chapters of the very last book in the Bible. John is exiled on the island of Patmos. There's a strange symmetry worth noticing right away. Ezekiel watched the glory leave from exile, beside a foreign river. Now John watches it arrive for good, also in exile, surrounded by water on a completely different side of the world. Both men are far from home, in places they never chose, when they see God do something enormous. There on Patmos, John is shown a vision of a new heaven and a new earth. A loud voice announces the sentence this entire story has been building toward, spoken out loud one final time. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. Then comes a detail that would have genuinely stunned any reader raised on temple festivals and pilgrim psalms. There's no temple in this city, none at all, not even a small symbolic one standing in for it. Its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb. 66 books spent assuming God's presence needs some kind of structure, a tent, a stone building, eventually a human body. The final vision removes the building entirely. Whatever this presence always pointed to all along, it apparently doesn't need a container anymore. That absence stands out even more precisely because nearly everything else in this vision gets measured. Gates, walls, foundations built from named gemstones, dimensions given down to specific numbers. Every other structure in that city gets cataloged in careful, exhaustive detail. And the one structure conspicuously missing from an otherwise exhaustive blueprint is the temple itself. So what happens to a story that opens with 13 chapters of tabernacle instructions once it finally reaches a point like this one? Look at that phrase again. The building was never really the point. It was the address change. Once that change is complete, once presence is total and unbroken and permanent, there's nothing left for any building to symbolize. There's something wide open about that, almost disorienting once it actually sinks in. A kind of joy too big to fit inside a floor plan, precisely because it no longer needs one. There's something else worth noticing, buried in the original language. The Greek word behind dwelling place in that verse comes from the exact same word family as a verb John already used decades earlier in his account of Jesus' life. This isn't a direct prophecy and fulfillment quotation, the kind where a writer points back and says, "This fulfills that." It's quieter than that. It's an echo carried in word choice rather than a citation, which is exactly why so many readers miss it entirely. "And the Word became flesh," John writes there, "and dwelt among us." Look closely at that verb. The Greek underneath dwelt is skenoo, and it literally means to tent, to pitch a tent, to encamp. It's built off the same root as skene, the Greek word for tent, the same word the Greek Old Testament uses for the tabernacle itself. Your English Bible just says dwelt, accurate but generic. There's no way to see in English that John reached for tent language on purpose. A few older, more literal English translations actually do better here. Young's literal translation renders it, "did tabernacle among us," and that keeps the echo visible in a way dwelt doesn't. John seems to be reaching back deliberately, framing Jesus' arrival as SHAKAN's most literal fulfillment yet. No cloud this time. God isn't filling a room with vapor anymore. He's present in a body, one that eats, walks, gets tired, and sleeps exactly the way any of us do. Nothing about it distant or symbolic anymore. It's worth being honest about one thing here, too. Nobody can actually prove John sat down and chose skenoo specifically to echo SHAKAN and mishkan. Plenty of good scholars think that's exactly what happened. The timing lines up. So does the glory language right after it. We have seen his glory. But a few scholars push back on that reading. They point out that skenoo was simply an ordinary Greek word for reside in everyday use. The echo on that view might be more of a fortunate accident of language than a planned callback. Think back to where this whole idea started, clearing out a guest room for someone who shows up with all their furniture, not a weekend visitor, someone actually moving in for good. That's exactly what a tent stitched from goat hair and acacia wood was, carried on ordinary shoulders through 40 long years of desert. That's what a stone temple with gold-lined walls was, too. Someone moving in, unpacking, choosing to stay. Then, for a while, the furniture went back out the door, and the room sat empty, watched from 900 miles away by a heartbroken priest. Then, eventually, it came back, promised forever this time, not just for a season. And then the guest stopped needing a guest room altogether. He moved in as a body instead, walking dusty roads among the very people he'd promised all along to live with. By the end of the story, there's no separate room left standing anywhere at all, because the guest didn't just move in once and stop there. He simply stayed, everywhere, permanently, unpacked for good, with no door left to walk through. All of that might still feel like ancient history, tents, temples, a vision from a prison island centuries ago. But this word was never really about the past. It's actually about you, specifically. If you've spent 30 or 40 years sitting in the same pew and can't remember the last time you felt anything there. Maybe it happened gradually, so slowly you can't point to the exact Sunday it started. Maybe it happened all at once, after retirement left your calendar strangely empty and your weekdays feeling unfamiliar, or after the particular chair beside you in that pew stayed empty too. Either way, you go through the motions now. You sing the songs, say the words, shake the same hands in the same lobby afterward. And privately, underneath all of it, you wonder whether God packed up and moved out somewhere along the way, or whether you did, or whether any of this was ever as real as it once felt. Nobody around you is likely to hear about that wondering. It doesn't come up over coffee after the service. It doesn't fit neatly into a prayer request, and it definitely doesn't fit into small talk in the church parking lot either. You just carry it quietly into the same pew week after week and carry it back out again, unspoken, the same as last Sunday and the Sunday before that. This word won't let you assume, though, that the numbness itself is proof of anything. What if it isn't evidence he packed up and left? Solomon stood in his own finished temple and asked out loud, in front of the entire nation, whether God would really live there. That question didn't disqualify him from anything. And whatever you're privately wondering doesn't disqualify you either. It was honest, coming from a king who had every reason in the world to sound certain instead, and chose not to fake it. SHAKAN was never a word about how something feels in a given moment. It was a word about where God decided to live, permanently, regardless of whether any particular Tuesday happens to feel like it. The whole story you've just walked through says the same thing over and over, in different centuries, through different people, in different kinds of grief and doubt entirely. It outlasted Solomon's doubt at his own dedication. It outlasted an empty room in Jerusalem, watched from 900 miles away by a heartbroken priest. That kind of presence was never running on how any single Tuesday happened to feel. And decades later, sitting exactly where you're sitting right now, it still isn't. Even the specific emptiness you're carrying right now has company somewhere in this story. Someone else once stood exactly where you're standing now, in a manner of speaking, watching a beloved place go quiet, genuinely wondering if the absence was permanent this time. It wasn't. It never actually was. The promise that came after it wasn't cautious or hedged. It was the word forever, spoken plainly, to someone who had every reason by then to doubt it. That's a strange kind of hope to actually sit with. It's spacious enough to feel almost disorienting once you let it in fully, the way any genuinely large thing can feel disorienting up close. A nearness so complete it doesn't need walls anymore, or a good mood, or a feeling you can point to on any given Tuesday in order to be real. He didn't move in as a temporary guest all those centuries ago. Nothing about how you feel this particular week has packed his bags for him. You might know someone like this. Someone who sat in the same pew for decades and would never say out loud that lately, if they're honest, God feels far away. This might genuinely be worth sending to them. Not as a fix for whatever they're carrying, just as a reminder that the ancient word for what they're missing was never actually about how close it felt on any given day. SHAKAN is the word the Bible uses every time God moves his address closer to his people. A tent in the wilderness, and centuries later, a body born in Bethlehem. However far away he feels on a given Tuesday, that address hasn't changed, and it was never going to.